The day after the British Grand Prix, the news broke that five-time Formula One world champion Juan Manuel Fangio had passed away in hospital at the age of 84. During the Argentine Grand Prix earlier in the year, he had received a party of guests from the McLaren Mercedes team and had been noticeably frail then, and had since suffered an attack of bronchopneumonia that proved to be his final illness. Argentine President Carlos Menem, who had won re-election shortly after the Argentine Grand Prix, announced 3 days of national mourning and arranged for Fangio to lie in state at the Casa Rosado, the president's official residence. The great and good of the motorsport world, including Stirling Moss and Jackie Stewart, Argentine drivers José Froilán González and Carlos Reutemann, the maestro's nephew, Juan Manuel Fangio II, a racing driver himself, as well as Max Mosley, and FIFA president João Havelange, a personal friend of Fangio, all descended on Argentina for the funeral. While in Europe and North America the name of Juan Manuel Fangio was known mainly by racing enthusiasts, in much of Latin America he'd been a colossal figure, and Argentina mourned him as Brazil had mourned Senna, though, of course, the news came as less of a shock in the circumstances. Following the news of the Srebrenica massacre earlier in July, pressure had mounted on the Western European governments to do something to end the bloodshed in the former Yugoslavia, especially as the UN peacekeeping force UNPROFOR seemed to be powerless to do anything, and the Bosnian Serb forces that had captured Srebrenica had now moved on to the nearby safe area of Žepa. The only road into Sarajevo, another safe area over Mount Igman, was now being threatened too, and when 2 French peacekeepers were killed within the safe area, the decision was taken to deploy a new Anglo-French rapid reaction force to take a more active role, capturing enough land with infantry, artillery and air support, and deploying engineers to widen the road and soldiers to defend it. The British Army deployed an additional 1,600 men. France, for her part, was rocked by an explosion at the Saint-Michel station on Paris's suburban RER train network, right by Notre Dame Cathedral, which killed 8 and injured 117. It looked like a terrorist attack, but when no one came forward to claim responsibility, the French government initiated an investigation and offered £1 million for anyone who could identify the perpetrators. There were further attacks, though none on the scale of the Saint-Michel bomb, and it soon became clear that the motive was the Algerian civil war, in which the government in Algiers, supported by that in Paris, was fighting an Islamist insurgency, and the bombers were hoping to force the French government to cut its support. When a bomb left by the TGV line from Paris to Lyon failed to explode, police were able to lift fingerprints and identify the bombers, one of whom was shot dead in Lyon in September. The Formula One circus headed from Silverstone to Hockenheim and traded loud flag-waving British patriotism for its German equivalent. And the expectations on Michael Schumacher were possibly higher even than those on Damon Hill at his home race. Not only was Schumacher driving in his home race as champion for the first time, but no German had ever won on home tarmac since the start of the championship in 1950. In fact, the last German to win on home tarmac had been Rudolf Caracciola, winning at the old Nürburgring in 1939. Certainly Schumacher's face and name were everywhere in Germany in mid-1995. I can attest to this, as I went on a family holiday to the Rhineland at some point during that summer. With a clothing brand, an energy drink, Deutsche Telekom phone cards, Willy Weber estimated they had around 60 Schumacher-branded products on the market. The man himself was deep in negotiations still with Ferrari. He had technical demands, for example that John Barnard be kept in post, but the sticking point was the price tag, now $75 million over 2 years. Luca di Montezemolo had had talks with Marlborough to see how much money they could put on the table, as well as persuading them they would have more success with Schumacher at Ferrari than if he went to also Marlborough-sponsored McLaren. Shell, having been rebuffed by Frank Williams, now approached Ferrari to see if they could displace Agip, with whom relations at Maranello were strained. They offered $20 million a year if Fiat would help them establish a sales network in Italy. Fiat were also asked about entering into a partnership with German car maintenance firm Dekra. Places were beginning to fall into place. On the Friday of race weekend, La Stampa ran an exclusive interview with Luca di Montezemolo, which seemed to confirm what everyone thought. He started off by criticising his current drivers, claiming that Alesi in particular was ungrateful and acting like a spoiled child for saying he'd been talking to other teams, then said that of course he would love to sign Schumacher, who wouldn't? Just in case anyone hadn't picked up the subtle messaging, Niki Lauda in the Hockenheim paddock provided a translation in his usual forthright style. He's fed up with hearing drivers who talk too much, who have behaved like idiots this year. Berger spouts nonsense only to deny it immediately afterwards. A few years ago, 2 or 3 drivers could realistically aim for victory. Today there's only one. Schumacher is the fastest of them all, stopwatch in hand. He's the one who makes the results. For their part, Alesi and Berger haven't always behaved like professionals. After their collision in Monaco, they sulked for 2 months. I too had problems with Clay Regazzoni when I was racing. Once the helmets are off, we'd insult each other for a good 10 minutes and then we'd go back to working together. For the team. Sensing the way that the wind was blowing, Flavio Briatore had reached out to Alesi and said, apropos of nothing in particular, that he'd always been a big fan. And the Ferrari PR people, meanwhile, were tearing their hair out and reminding everyone that Niki Lauda spoke for himself, not for the team, and wheeled out Juan and Gerhard to pose arm-in-arm for the photographers. There was another divorce too, this one formalised on Friday, as Alain Prost parted ways with Renault for the second time. Now 40-year-old Alain had become unhappy that his paymasters had declined to support his ambitions to launch a racing team, and was becoming increasingly bored doing a couple of laps in a souped-up Renault Espace and then schmoozing at functions. What next for Prost was unknown, of course, though he'd had a chat with Norbert Haug about possibly doing something in Deep TM, while Ron Dennis would undoubtedly like to get him back at Woking in some capacity, possibly even as a driver for 1996. But the throngs of fans descending on Baden-Württemberg at the end of July couldn't have cared less about most of that, and apart from winning the race and negotiating with Ferrari, Michael Schumacher's biggest challenge for the weekend was to get around without constantly being mobbed for autographs and photos. It probably seemed like a good idea at the time for Heinz-Harald Frentzen to release his own line of HHF edition sportswear at the Grand Prix, but nobody noticed. And of course, after Silverstone, not only were the fans vocally supporting Schumacher, but Damon Hill had become public enemy number 1, even more than usual. Some of the banners were reasonably good-natured, comparing him to Benny Hill, who remained inexplicably popular in Germany. Others read, "Kill Hill," and other, less repeatable sentiments, so Damon was, if anything, even more nervous than last year. Elsewhere in the paddock, and likewise entirely ignored by the masses in the stands, Aguri Suzuki was back in the Ligier, as Tom Walkinshaw sought to keep Honda sweet as he set about renegotiating the engine deal for next year, meaning Martin Brundle was back on co-commentary duties with the BBC, while Bertrand Gachot had given way in the Pacific cockpit to one Giovanni Lavaggi, an Italian noble of limited competitive credentials but deep pockets. Car number 16, Giovanni Lavaggi. Born to a minor family of Sicilian nobility in 1958, Giovanni Lavaggi's family credentials were impeccable for a career in motorsport. His father had seen some success in racing before his retirement in 1963, while his uncle and namesake had been an ace pilot in the Regia Aeronautica, fascist Italy's air force, before being killed in a plane crash near Cairo under suspicious circumstances, one of his passengers having been Public Works Minister Luigi Razza, which is why both Catania and Augusta, on Sicily, both have a Via Giovanni Lavaggi. But young Giovanni's father was absolutely opposed to his son going into motorsport, and instead he became an engineering student in Milan. But although he would never see a lira of the family money to do it, young Giovanni was absolutely determined to race something. He dabbled at skiing, broke a leg hang gliding, did a bit of rallycross motorbiking, all while studying and working multiple jobs to raise the money. He was finally able to enrol in the Henry Morra driving school in Magione and entered his first car racing championship at 26, coming second overall in the 1984 Fiat Panda Championship. But money was tight again, and he ended up working from 1986 to 91 as a management consultant and racing on the side, doing a bit of endurance and sports car racing with small Italian teams. He had a modicum of success in the World Sports Car Championship in 1988, a highlight being a 7th at Brands Hatch co-driving with team owner Antoine Salamin and Jean-Denis Delatraz. That got him a better drive in 1989, driving 5 races plus Le Mans for the Porsche Kramer team, coming third at the Nürburgring, and another 2 for Salamin, all of which earned him the Autosport magazine gold medal. 1990 saw the Count move to the Interserie Championship, finishing second to that year's champion Bernd Schneider in 2 rounds. He still wanted to do single-seater racing though, and managed to wangle an F3000 berth for 1991 with the Krypton team, which was a disaster as he only qualified for 2 rounds and only finished 1, but his money got him a test drive with the March team in 1992 with an eye on taking the race seat in 1993, only for the team to collapse that winter and send him back to Interserie, where he won the series to take his first ever championship title. So it was off to the USA to see if kart racing would be any happier of a hunting ground. It wasn't, his 4 events with the leader cards team in outdated Lola chassis, yielding 15th and a lap down at Elkhart Lake as its highlight. As 1995 began, he rejoined the Kramer team for their entry into the Daytona 24 Hours where, sharing with Jürgen Lessig, Christophe Bouchou and Marco Werner, he won the race by 5 laps, albeit somewhat overshadowed by 70-year-old Paul Newman coming third. With the prize money from that and the sponsorship opportunities it created, Lavaggi was able to buy his way into the cash-strapped Pacific team. At 37, he's the second oldest driver ever to make his F1 debut, the oldest being Toshio Suzuki in 1994, so Giovanni, nicknamed Johnny Car Wash, a loose translation of his name, is unlikely to be at the start of a glorious F1 career. And finally, Japanese driver Taki Inoue had a small announcement of his own to make. In response to new French President Jacques Chirac resuming French nuclear testing in the Pacific, the ocean, not the car, he would be boycotting all French media appearances. He didn't make many French media appearances, he barely spoke English and spoke no French at all, and there was basically no French interest in the Footwork Arrows team, but it was important to him to stand on his principles. And so, with the French government quaking in its stylish yet affordable boots, they set out for qualifying on Friday in changeable conditions, with rain showers dampening the track down. Not enough to require wet tyres, but enough to send the cars slithering around and producing a haze of mist. Suzuki came a bit of a cropper in the treacherous conditions and hit the wall hard enough to have to go and have his vision checked, but Hill, who'd become a father for the 3rd time a week before the race with the birth of daughter Tabitha, ended the day on top of the timings as the sun came out later in the session. Saturday morning was misty, but the track was still packed, and by the time the cars came out in the afternoon, conditions were just about perfect, so it would be a cracking battle for pole. Schumacher set the early running, and Coulthard was absolutely storming it too, but Hill went out and went round quicker. Schumacher's next attempt was just 800ths off, and that was the best he could do, having to resign himself to second on the grid as Hill took his 3rd successive pole. Coulthard's efforts netted him 3rd, 0.075 seconds behind Schumacher, and over a second ahead of 4th place Berger, who had enjoyed the handling of his new chassis even if the car just lacked straight-line speed. Next up were the Jordans, Rubens ahead of Eddie, and the McLarens, Mika ahead of Mark, with Johnny Herbert a chastening 19th and nearly 2 seconds adrift after his Silverstone heroics, and Alesi a thoroughly disgruntled 10th, just unable to get his chassis balanced. Frentzen continued to do the best he could in the sluggish Sauber in 11th, alongside Panis, with Sarlo an encouraging 13th for Tyrrell, who'd been doing A/B testing with the troublesome Hydrolink suspension and found that even at the billiard table smooth Manicore it just wasn't doing the business, so it was formally dropped. Papis impressed again in 15th ahead of the Japanese trio of Katayama, Suzuki and Inoue, with Pierluigi Martini last of the serious teams, suffering the lack of grunt of the Ford V8 but still 3 seconds ahead of Diniz, with Moreno 22nd, the 40s both beating the Pacifics for the first time, but that was because Montemini's best time on Saturday had been chalked off for doing 1 lap too many, and Lavaggi was just getting the hang of things. It had certainly been an entertaining hour's qualifying, and much more so than the damp squib at Silverstone 2 weeks earlier. There were suggestions that given the increasing numbers of people watching qualifying, both on TV and at the track, to avoid dead sessions like that one in the future, there would be a single session, forcing everyone to go out regardless of conditions, though of course the flip side would be a day's lost ticket sales at the tracks, so it wasn't an open and shut case either. Other formats were suggested, such as qualifying on the combined times from Friday and Saturday rather than picking the best single lap, and while they were considering that, the incident between Mark Blundell and Rubens Barrichello had prompted calls for a clarification in the rules about how much a driver defending his place could move around under braking. The sun came out on Sunday, and by the time the grid assembled for the start, it was getting quite warm, with track temperatures up to 42 degrees Celsius, which could really throw a spanner in the works as teams had no experience of running in these conditions on this track with these regulations. Last year's race had been in similar temperatures at least, and just like in 1994, the fans at the track were at fever pitch, but hopefully there wouldn't be a massive accident that took out half the field this time. They lined up in the shimmering heat haze in the cauldron of the stadium section, and then they were away, Hill holding his lead from Schumacher, with Coulthard third, while Berger was somehow holding off 3 other cars, both Jordans and Hakkinen, with Barrichello having got a great start to pass Mika, then disposed of his teammate further round the lap, with Hakkinen following a little later. but the other Micker wouldn't even see the end of lap 1, his Tyrrell's transmission giving up after just 200 metres. As they came round to start lap 2, the rear of Hill's Williams just snapped out under braking, pitching him into the barriers at turn 1 to the delighted roar of the crowd. So Schumacher was in the lead with Coulthard behind and finished lap 2 in a blizzard of German and sky blue Benetton flags. Behind him, Blundell had overtaken Herbert to take what was now 7th, followed quickly by a Lazy charging even harder than usual to make up for his disappointing qualifying. Schumacher was slowly pulling out a gap over Coulthard, while Berger seemed to be holding up a fired-up Barrichello. Not for long, though, as on lap 5 the now traditional jump-start penalty notice brought Berger in for a 10-second stop-go, returning him to the track 17th. So that meant the top 6 were now Schumacher, Coulthard, Barrichello, Häkkinen, Irvine and Blundell, with a Lazy 7th and within sniffing distance of the points, while Herbert, suffering from a dicky electronic throttle, now dropped back behind Panis. No such problems for Schumacher, who had made the gap to Coulthard over 4 seconds by lap 7. Further back, a Lazy had now got past Blundell into the points, and the McLaren now had Panis right on its tail too, while behind them the other German, Frentzen, was 10th and next in the queue to take advantage of Herbert's throttle. Further back again, Berger had disposed of Bouillon, Suzuki and Badeur to climb to 11th place as he tried to recover from his penalty and was bearing down on Frentzen. Irvine was also dropping back, now 10 seconds behind Häkkinen, with a Lazy a couple of seconds back and approaching, but the Frenchman was hearing some suspicious noises from his engine and radioed the pits to tell him he was coming in to get it checked. Unfortunately, his radio cut out as he bounced through the forest, and the message didn't get through, so when Jean peeled in at the end of lap 11, there was absolute panic in the Ferrari pits, with neither tyres nor fuel hose ready, and a Lazy was sent on his way after 25 seconds stationary, now 15th, and still hadn't had his engine looked at. Schumacher was lapping the first of the back markers by that point, Giovanni Lavaggi in the Pacific, with Papis, gearbox, Diniz, brakes, Inoue, gearbox, and Martini, engine, all having joined Salo and Hill in retirement, and the next lap there was another retirement as a Lazy trailed back in, with his engine still just not working right. Unseen, Moreno was also in to get the 40 team to reattach his engine cover which had come loose. It was starting to get into the window for a two-stop strategy, and on lap 14 Panis was in but had a real job getting going again and didn't get much further than the exit of the pit lane, having sprung a leak in his coolant system and overheated his Mugen. Next in was Barrichello, out in 7th and emerging right in the middle of an enormous scrap, with Blundell having just passed Irvine ahead of him, while right behind Rubens were Herbert, Frentzen and Berger, who were all lapping Lavaggi. Berger was all over the Sauber in front and quickly made it the Sauber behind instead, as Barrichello on fresh tyres passed Irvine. The Ulsterman was having some throttle problems of his own, it turned out, and Herbert soon came past with Berger and Frentzen charging through in turn. On lap 18, Blundell's Mercedes expired smokily, which made the order Schumacher, Coulthard, Häkkinen, Barrichello, Berger, Herbert in the points, now chased by Frentzen, Irvine, Bouillon and Badeur in the top 10. Schumacher was still fairly comfortable in the lead, but Coulthard had managed to stay with him and stabilised the gap at about 5 seconds. Schumacher came in on lap 20 of the 45, so either that was a late 2-stop or an early 1-stop. 9 seconds, so really quick if it was a 1-stopper, which got him out behind Coulthard and Häkkinen, who came in next time round and rejoined 4th, after a stop a full 5 seconds slower than Schumacher's, which suggested that Schumacher was indeed on a 2-stop race. Barrichello's Peugeot gave up the ghost on the same lap, retirement number 10, while Coulthard's 15-second lead was being shrunk by a charging Schumacher on fresh tyres, setting what would turn out to be the fastest lap of the race on lap 22. Frentzen came in from 6th as well, naturally covered in full by RTL. Coulthard was in on lap 23, stationary for 15.5 seconds and rejoining 2nd, while Häkkinen regained 3rd when Berger stopped, and Herbert lost 6th to Frentzen when he stopped, all of which meant that on lap 25, with 20 to go, Schumacher led Coulthard by 18 seconds, with Häkkinen now 3rd, then Berger, Frentzen and Herbert. Those last two were running close together, with Herbert a second a lap faster than the Sauber, just as Schumacher was a second a lap faster than Coulthard. Suzuki, running 7th, had a puncture on his left rear and bounced across the gravel before heading back in for new boots, re-emerging 12th, which put Bouillon up to 7th as Frentzen pitted again, promoting Herbert, but HH was far enough ahead of his teammate to retain 6th. Schumacher had pulled the gap out to about 21 seconds on lap 29 as Irvine came in from 8th to have his engine remapped and set off again to see if attrition would be his friend today. He had reasons for optimism. Lavaggi's gearbox gave up, while Moreno and Badoer both pulled into their pits with, respectively, a broken half-shaft and an oil leak. Both of those were behind Irvine, who was now 7th, but before long Frenzen's Ford Z-Tech went bang as he pursued Herbert, which put Bouillon up into the points, and then the next lap Häkkönen's Mercedes followed suit. So as the Benetton pit crew prepared to receive Schumacher for his second stop, Berger was up to 3rd, Herbert 4th, Bouillon now 5th, and Irvine was in the points, in 6th place with only 9 still running, Katayama, Suzuki and Montemini the remaining survivors. Schumacher pitted a very quick 7.2 seconds, getting him out still in the lead to the roar of the crowd, who realised that the race was all but won, with Schumacher still 7 seconds ahead of Coulthard with 10 laps to go. And with fresh tyres, the home hero was quickly pulling away again, lapping Bouillon, while Suzuki got past his countryman Katayama as Berger approached to lap the pair of them. With 5 laps to go, Coulthard had stabilised the gap at about 11 seconds, as apparently neither he nor Schumacher felt inclined to risk their engine by pushing too hard, and with Berger nearly a minute adrift in 3rd, it didn't seem like there would be much excitement left in the race, not that the delirious fans in the stands minded one bit. Irvine's engine control unit, though, finally gave up the ghost of 2 laps to go, promoting Suzuki to 6th, but he was also listening to some funny noises coming from his engine. Schumacher drove an immaculate and drama-free last couple of laps to take a historic win, the first German to win the German Grand Prix in the history of the Formula One Championship, and neither he nor the tens of thousands at the track cared remotely that it had actually been rather a dull race in the end. Schumacher stopped not far across the line. He'd stalled it, overcome with the emotion of the moment, though at least one fan thought he'd stopped to pick up a German flag. Resolutely refusing to take the flag from the fan lest there be some kind of penalty that soured his win, Schumacher would complete his victory lap under tow, with flares and fireworks joining the flags in celebration. Suzuki's Mugen detonated just as he crossed the line, and he pulled over to deploy the fire extinguisher. And with the forest still full of Grand Prix drivers making the long way home, Coulthard stopped to give Barrichello a lift, and Berger picked up Häkkinen. Personally, even at slowing down lap speeds, I'd put my helmet back on, but that's why I'm not a racing driver. With Schumacher slowly making his way round, Berger and Coulthard spent some time swapping notes while they waited for him to come round so they could all take to the podium. Tyrrell put in a slightly speculative appeal against Ligier in the hopes of nabbing that last point for Katayama, on the grounds that Suzuki hadn't returned to the Parc Ferme after finishing, but the stewards gave it the short shrift it deserves, pointing out that since his car was on fire, he couldn't really be expected to. And so Herbert, who ran out of fuel on the slowing down lap, Bouillon and Suzuki picked up the remaining points. Bouillon taking 2 points for Sauber in just his 5th Grand Prix, undeniably aided by attrition, but still a great morale boost after his tough F1 baptism. So Michael Schumacher pulled out his lead over Damon Hill to 21 points, and with neither a lazy nor Hill scoring, Coulthard, Berger and Herbert all closed up to each other and to the top 3. Mercedes would be disappointed to have a double engine failure at their home race, and just to put the boot in, Suzuki's point lifted Ligier above McLaren, who dropped down to 6th in the Constructors' Championship, where Benetton also increased their lead, and Williams closed up again to within a point of Ferrari. Next up was Hungary. A more different circuit to Hockenheim would be hard to imagine, and a circuit which held good memories for Damon Hill, who'd won his maiden race there in 1993.